I'm Marjorie Lindell, 71 years old, and when I stepped out of that rideshare after visiting a friend upstate, I expected to see my porch light glowing like always. But instead, I found my suitcase sitting against the bushes, half unzipped. A lamp toppled on the doormat, and my photo frame tucked beneath a piece of folded paper. 6 words written in my son's handwriting said it all. "Sorry, Mom. No space for you anymore." I didn't knock. I didn't cry. I just stood there in the quiet with the realization that I hadn't just been pushed aside. I had been replaced without a second thought. Before I go any further, let me know where you're listening from in the comments and tap that like button if you've ever had to hold your head high when someone treated you like you were invisible. I was born in a small Ohio town, raised by a schoolteacher and a man who fixed clocks for a living. They taught me the kind of values that weren't loud but lasting. Humility over pride, truth over ease. I married Richard Lindell Young, and we made a life together full of small routines and quiet love. We had one child, Brendan, and from the start, I poured everything into giving him a good life. I never needed much. We didn't have the kind of money that built vacation homes or sent kids to Ivy Leagues. But we had stability, a roof that didn't leak, a kitchen filled with home-cooked meals, and a garden out back where I taught Brendan to dig. Without disturbing the roots after Richard passed, I stayed in the home we'd built together. It wasn't grand, but it had character. Original crown molding, a creaky stairwell that groaned every time someone stayed up too late, and rooms filled with memories. Brendan moved out for college, came back for a few years, and then met Kayla. She was polite, well put together, a little too polished for my taste, but I kept that to myself. They moved in after their apartment flooded, and though it was meant to be temporary, somehow, years slipped by. I adjusted, gave them the master bedroom. Let Kayla take over small things first, the grocery list, then the thermostat, then the bills. Still, I tried to be gracious, even when Kayla began making subtle suggestions about how the house might be better utilized, or how the kitchen could use a more modern touch. I reminded myself that families evolve, that people change and make room for each other. And for a long time, I thought we had balance, not perfect, not close, but tolerable, until that evening when I returned and saw my belongings laid out like discarded donations. My lamp sideways on the step, my pillow with the frayed corners resting atop a plastic bin. My framed photographs of Brendan and Richard tucked beneath that single note that folded paper may as well have been a wall. I walked away, not because I was defeated, but because I understood. In that moment, there was nothing left to defend. The porch light was off. The curtains stayed drawn, and not one shadow moved behind the window. As I turned the corner, I looked back once just to be sure, but the house stayed still, like I had never lived there at all. I didn't call anyone that night. Instead, I sat on a bench near the community garden where I used to take Brendan as a boy. The breeze rustled the leaves above me, and somewhere deep in my chest, I felt something shift. Not pain, exactly. Not yet, but a kind of slow unspooling. The next morning, I woke early. The air was still cold, and the light had a softness that made the world feel almost forgiving. I wandered through the neighborhood with no destination, and somewhere along the way, I passed a row of new townhomes. One had wide windows and neat railings. I paused, and then I saw them, Brendan and Kayla inside, seated at a table with a folder between them. Her smile was tight. His shoulders slumped, and just like that, the silence from the night before gave way to something clearer. This hadn't been a decision made in haste. It had been planned. The signs were there all along, and I had chosen not to see them. But now I did, and as I stepped back from the glass, I realized the worst part wasn't that they had removed me from the house. It was that they had done it so quietly, so completely, that it almost seemed like I had never been there at all. The bus dropped me off 2 blocks from the library just before the doors opened. I hadn't slept much, and my phone was still dead from the night before. Inside, the building was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums through carpeted hallways and rows of books no one's opened in years. I found an outlet near a corner window and sat down with my back to the wall. When the phone buzzed back to life, only one notification appeared, one missed call from Brendan. No voicemail, no message, just a timestamp from late the night before. I stared at the screen for a long while, then turned it face down on the table. The quiet inside the library felt different than the silence outside that house. This was the kind of silence that didn't hurt. It gave space instead of taking it. I sat there a while, sipping water from a bottle I'd packed in my purse and listening to the low shuffle of pages and the occasional click of a keyboard. Then I heard my name. Soft at first, then again, clearer this time. I looked up and saw Martina Wilkes standing by the end of the row, her coat still dusted from the cold air outside. We hadn't seen each other in years. Martina used to sit 2 desks down from me when we worked insurance claim reviews. She was sharp-fast with paperwork and even faster with reading people. Always kept a peppermint tin in her purse and a highlighter in her sleeve. She gave me a small smile and gestured toward the coffee machine near the back hallway. We walked there together without saying much. She poured 2 small cups and led me to a bench near the side window where the sun hit the floor in soft rectangles. She asked if I was just passing time. I nodded. I wasn't ready to explain anything yet, and she didn't push. After some talk about old coworkers and city traffic, her tone shifted. She mentioned that she'd seen Kayla at a property event just last week. Said Kayla had been cheerful, talking openly about listing the house and looking at a new place not far from a golf course outside the city. Martina assumed I'd already moved out. She paused, then looked at me. Her eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but with concern. "You knew, right?" she asked, carefully. I didn't answer right away, just looked out the window. Martina had seen enough cases to recognize when something didn't line up. She leaned in slightly and asked if I still had access to the deed. I told her I had a copy somewhere, or at least I used to. She told me to double-check everything ownership co-signers utility changes mail forwarding. She once worked a case where a woman's daughter-in-law had quietly filed power of attorney papers, moved her into assisted living, and sold the house within 6 weeks. My chest tightened, but not from surprise. Her story felt too close to mine to ignore. She handed me her card, though I already had her number in an old address book somewhere. She said she still did part-time consulting, mostly for women going through complicated transitions with family or property. We sat together for a while, no talking, just sitting. That was always the difference with old friends. They didn't need explanations. They just stayed. Later that afternoon, I walked to the post office and rented a small mailbox under my name. It was the first concrete thing I'd done since I found my belongings outside the house. A simple steel drawer, a key on a ring, and a number I could write down. It wasn't much, but it gave me a way to intercept anything they might still try to redirect insurance paperwork, tax forms, anything I hadn't thought to protect before. That evening, I checked into a women's shelter for a few nights. It was warm, clean quiet. I watched the sunlight stretch across the sidewalk through the small window in the hallway, and felt a kind of stillness I hadn't known in weeks. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was the beginning of clarity. The next morning, I stood in front of a building I hadn't seen in more than 5 years. A narrow door between a bookstore and a laundromat with a buzzer that stuck when you pressed too hard. My old studio. I kept the lease after Richard died. It had been our quiet space above the bookstore where I did part-time consulting and sorted claims for clients no one else had time for. The lock still stuck the way it always did. The air smelled like dust and lemon oil. Nothing had been touched. The bookshelf still leaned slightly to the left. The same faded lavender sachet sat in the drawer. I ran my fingers along the desk and opened the old cabinet. Beneath the folders and paperwork, I found what I needed: the deed to the house, notarized and signed. My name, no one else's, not even Brendan's. I sat down and spread the documents out across the desk. The co-ownership agreement Richard and I had written before we ever closed on the house. The language was clear: if one of us passed, the other kept full ownership. We had never added Brendan. We never planned to. It was never meant to be a legacy. It was meant to be a home. My home. There were utility bills, too. I had brought some with me from the house without realizing it. Water, gas, trash, each one now addressed to Kayla. My name had been erased in a matter of weeks. There was a copy of a service transfer form with a signature that wasn't mine. I could tell instantly. The handwriting was too neat. My stomach didn't drop this time. I just felt still. I gathered the deed, the co-ownership papers, and the most recent tax return with the property listed under my name. I placed them inside the small fireproof safe beneath the desk, along with a copy of my ID. Then I closed it, locked it, and tucked the key into my coat pocket. That room held no pictures of Brendan. Just one framed photo of Richard and me from a community fundraiser. We were laughing, caught in the middle of a moment before anything broke. I closed the studio door softly behind me. Not because I was afraid of slamming it, but because it felt like something sacred had just been disturbed. The next morning, I walked into Martina's office holding a large manila envelope tight against my chest. She looked up from her desk without speaking, just gestured for me to sit. I laid the documents in front of her: deed, agreement, bills, the forged utility form. She didn't speak right away. She turned page after page, flipping back twice, then leaned back in her chair and let out a slow breath. "This wasn't a mistake," she said. "They're preparing to move without you, and I think they expected you not to fight back." Her words didn't sting. They settled in like bricks on a foundation I hadn't realized I was still building. Martina picked up her phone and called a woman named Ashby Sterling, someone she used to work with. Ashby was a retired estate attorney who now did private consulting for women protecting their assets in late-life transitions. According to Martina, Ashby didn't just read contracts, she read people. 2 days later, I stood on the porch of Ashby's small home office holding the same envelope. Her eyes were sharp and her tone was calm, steady. I handed her the documents. She read through them without saying much, then looked up and said evenly, "None of this changes your ownership. The utility changes the mail, redirect the digital form. None of that is legally binding. But if they try to use it to sell or borrow against the property, that crosses the line." She outlined everything step by step. A formal cease and desist. A flag at the county records office. Legal filings that would alert any realtor or financial institution in the area. It wouldn't stop every attempt, but it would slow them down and draw a firm line. By the time I left, Martina had already arranged couriers to deliver sealed copies to Brendan's workplace and Kayla's clinic. Ashby had drafted a protective memo for the neighborhood council and flagged the house in the real estate network. That night, I stood in the hallway outside Ashby's office and caught my reflection in the glass. I looked tired, but something behind my eyes felt steady again. They had mistaken my silence for surrender. That was the mistake they wouldn't make again. A week passed before the first knock came. I was seated by the window in the old studio sorting through a stack of files when the sound startled me. It wasn't urgent, just firm enough to pull me to the door. Brendan stood there, coat half-zipped, shoulder stiff. His face looked worn in a way I hadn't seen before, the way someone looks when they've gone too long without answers. I didn't invite him in right away. I opened the door just enough to see him clearly and waited. He asked if we could talk. I stepped aside without a word, letting him enter but not making space for comfort. He stood by the desk, eyeing the folders spread across it. His gaze settled on the envelope from Ashby. I didn't offer an explanation. I waited. He turned toward me and said he hadn't known about everything, that Kayla had been the one managing the logistics, that she thought I needed rest. His voice was even practiced. When I asked why he didn't stop her, he looked at the floor. He said it had seemed easier not to push back, that he didn't want conflict, that he thought I wouldn't mind. There was no apology in his tone, just an admission of distance. He hadn't chosen her over me. He had chosen silence. I told him the documents had been filed, the alerts placed, and that the house was no longer vulnerable. I didn't explain further. I didn't need to. When he left, he paused at the door like he wanted to say something more, but nothing came. The next few days were quiet. I didn't hear from Brendan or Kayla. I didn't expect to. Then on a Saturday morning, a courier arrived with a white envelope. My name was printed cleanly across the front. Inside was a letter from a real estate agency addressed not to me but to Brendan and Kayla. It referenced an inquiry about listing the house. A carbon copy of a request form was included, unsigned, but clearly in progress. I called Martina. She came over within the hour. Her eyes moved quickly over the papers. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. We both understood what this was, an attempt to test the boundaries, to see if they could push the process forward before anyone caught it. Martina contacted Ashby immediately. By that afternoon, Ashby had filed a second restriction with the property office and flagged the real estate agency directly. Any future attempts to access or discuss the property without my explicit consent would now trigger a legal notice. It was clear then. They weren't just trying to move on, they were trying to erase me from the structure of things, not just emotionally, but legally. I didn't panic. I didn't reach out. That evening, I walked the length of the hallway in the studio, glanced at my reflection in the mirror, and sat by the window without turning on the light. I could see the edges of the city from there, the dull orange of traffic lights, and the soft blue cast of storefront signs. It was still my name on the deed, but that didn't stop the ache from settling in deeper. Sunday afternoon brought Brendan again. This time, he didn't knock. He stood just outside until I opened the door. His expression had changed. He wasn't uncertain now, he was measured, controlled. He asked if we could speak privately. I stayed in the doorway. He told me Kayla had made a mistake, that they had moved too quickly, that she feared retaliation. He used words like misunderstanding and communication breakdown. I said very little. When I did speak, I looked him in the eye and told him the truth he already knew. He had known what was happening. He had allowed it because it made things easier. He didn't deny it. He said he hadn't known how to navigate it, that standing between me and Kayla felt impossible. His voice cracked slightly. But what I heard wasn't regret. It was exhaustion. He hadn't been forced into this. He had chosen the path of least resistance, and that I realized would never change. I thanked him for coming and closed the door behind him. It wasn't an act of anger. It was finality. Later that week, I visited Martina again. I brought a box of scones and set them on her desk like we used to after long shifts at the firm. She stood by the window holding a file that looked heavier than usual. Without a word, she laid out the pages, scanned documents, email threads, authorization forms. At the top was an application for a home equity loan. Brendan's name was listed. So was mine. Next to my name was a signature that resembled mine, but wasn't. The curves were off. The pressure inconsistent. A scanned ID was attached, my old driver's license. A copy of a utility bill with my name barely legible at the top, enough to appear real to someone skimming quickly. Martina's voice was quiet. He created a joint profile, she said. He submitted a full loan application. Ashby arrived later that afternoon. She examined every page, then said calmly, "This is forgery. If it was submitted digitally, it may also fall under wire fraud." Her tone didn't change. She pulled out a form and began writing. A complaint was filed with the bank's fraud department. A notification was submitted to the district attorney's office under a soft flag. Then she added something else, a formal freeze on any transaction involving my name or address. No one could move anything forward without my physical signature notarized and present. By the time I left Martina's office that evening, every document had been backed up in 3 different places. Copies were sealed and stored. Alerts had been triggered in the local property system. I walked home with the folder pressed to my chest. Not out of fear, but steadiness. It was no longer about the house, it was about being written out and writing myself back in. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Brendan. It was brief. They were hosting a family discussion that Saturday. He said he hoped I could come, that it was time to clear the air. I stared at the words on the screen. The phrase family discussion rang hollow, but I forwarded the message to Ashby. She replied a few minutes later. "Let me come with you, just in case." I agreed. Saturday arrived with a steady wind and a sky thick with low gray clouds. Ashby picked me up in her navy sedan just before noon. She wore a wool coat and carried her briefcase in one hand, a small bound folder tucked beneath her arm. The drive was quiet, not because we didn't have anything to say, but because we both knew what was waiting. As we turned onto my old street, the house came into view, looking almost too perfect. White shutters, a red front door, and flower boxes still clinging to the last of the season's petunias. Inside, the living room had been staged. Not in a formal sense, but in the kind of way people do when they want to control the mood. A cheese board sat untouched on the coffee table. Candles flickered on the mantel. Cushions were fluffed with care. Kayla stood near the fireplace in a pale sweater, her hair pulled back neatly. Brendan opened the door and offered a quick handshake, his eyes flicking between me and Ashby. He looked prepared, like someone stepping into a meeting they didn't want but had decided to manage. We sat. No one reached for the food. Kayla spoke first, her voice even and steady. "We know things have been tense," she said. "This meeting is about clearing the air and moving forward with respect." She gestured toward the room. "This is still your home, too." Her words landed with practiced smoothness, but Ashby didn't give them room to breathe. She opened her folder, placed a notarized letter on the table, and spoke clearly. "This property belongs solely to my client, Marjorie Lindell," she said. "She remains the legal owner on all documentation. Any representation otherwise has been challenged, filed, and recorded." Her tone was calm, almost gentle, but it didn't waver. "This is not a negotiation. This is a confirmation." The silence that followed stretched long. Brendan paled slightly, his fingers curling in his lap. Kayla blinked twice, her mouth tightening. Ashby continued. "We're aware of forged authorization attempts submitted to various institutions. Those actions have been reported and flagged. At this time, my client reserves the right to pursue legal action." Kayla's voice dropped a register. "This isn't how we wanted to do things." I looked at her for the first time that day. Really looked. And what I saw wasn't defiance. It was control slipping. Brendan tried to speak, but stopped himself. He stared at the document in front of him, jaw tense. I stood. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't ask for explanation. I simply said, "You tried to write me out of my own life. You thought I wouldn't notice." Then I turned toward the door. Ashby followed her briefcase, clicking gently against her side. Before stepping out, she paused. "If there are further attempts to interfere with my client's property or identity, legal proceedings will begin immediately." Her tone never changed. It didn't have to. Outside, the air was colder, but it felt sharper in a clean way. We didn't speak on the ride back. I sat still, looking out at the moving trees, their bare branches shaking in the wind. The next morning, I packed an overnight bag and returned to the house, not to reclaim it, but to finish something. I let myself in with the key. The hallway smelled faintly of eucalyptus. Kayla was in the kitchen washing dishes. Her hands moved with unnecessary force. Brendan sat at the dining table, his palms flat, his face unreadable. I stood near the threshold, not moving farther than I needed to. Then I spoke. "I'm selling the house." The words were simple. I said them the way someone names a day of the week. Kayla froze. Brendan looked up. His lips parted but didn't form words. "Not out of spite," I said. "Not as punishment, just because it's mine, and I no longer want to share my name with walls that have forgotten me." I set a folder on the table. Inside was the listing agreement. Ashby had handled everything, every detail prepared with precision. Brendan's voice cracked as he asked, "But where will you live?" I met his eyes. "That's not your concern anymore." He blinked and looked away. Kayla didn't speak. Her shoulders trembled slightly, but I offered no comfort. That part of me had already been spent. As I turned to leave, I paused and said what needed saying. "The sale proceeds won't go to either of you." I watched Kayla's spine stiffen. Brendan's shoulders sank. I continued. "The funds are being transferred to a foundation, one for women over 60 who've been pushed aside or written out by the people they trusted." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't elaborate. "Martina will serve as executive director. Ashby is overseeing compliance." That was all they needed to know. I stepped back, letting the moment settle around them. This house built a family, but a family doesn't survive when love turns into leverage. So I'm letting it go. You made space by pushing me out. Now I'll make space for someone else who needs it. I walked to the door, opened it without a glance behind me, and stepped out into the morning air. The frost still clung to the sidewalk, but the sun had broken through. I stood there for a breath, then kept walking. The apartment was small, but the light poured in from the east-facing window every morning just after 7. I'd moved in quietly, without ceremony, one overnight bag in hand. Ashby and Martina had handled the logistics transfer forms, closing documents, the escrow account for the foundation. I hadn't stepped foot back into the old house since I left that morning with the signed listing papers. The sale went through in under 3 weeks. No delays, no surprises. Brendan and Kayla moved out before the final inspection. There was no letter, no call, no message left behind. The first few nights in the new place were the quietest I could remember. I filled the space slowly. A clay pot with lavender sat on the kitchen sill. A chair by the window faced the sunrise. There were no family photos on the walls. Just a single picture of me alone on the coast, taken years ago during a weekend trip I barely remembered. It felt right to start fresh without reminders. Most mornings I laced up my walking shoes and followed the trail behind the building. It curved past low pine trees and a narrow creek. I waved to the same woman each morning, mid-40s, blonde ponytail, golden retriever at her side. We never exchanged words, but after the second week, she smiled first. There was something steady about it, like clockwork in a world that had gone off rhythm for too long. Martina visited often. She brought warm pastries in a paper bag and news about the foundation. Donations were slow but steady. One afternoon, she handed me a handwritten letter from a woman in Utah. She had read about the fund in a church bulletin. The letter was brief. She wrote, "Thank you for existing." I read it twice. I placed the envelope in a drawer beneath my notebooks. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Brendan never reached out again. Neither did Kayla. There were no questions about the sale, no objections about the foundation. The silence didn't feel like absence anymore. It felt like breathing room. In the evenings, I sometimes wrote. Loose pages, nothing formal. Bits of memory details I hadn't touched in years. I wrote about Richard's laugh. I wrote about the garden. I wrote about silence, how it can suffocate when it's forced, but how it can heal when it's chosen. One morning, a woman from a local nonprofit called. She'd heard about the foundation and wanted to know if I would consider speaking at a community seminar on elder autonomy. I agreed without hesitation. It wasn't a grand event, just a folding chair room above a city center cafe, but I stood at the front and told my story plainly. I didn't name names. I didn't raise my voice. I just spoke until the room felt still. After the seminar, a younger woman approached me, early 30s, careful with her words. She said she'd been helping her mother untangle a complicated property situation after a divorce. Her mother had been told not to push, not to ask too many questions. They had almost lost the house. She thanked me. I didn't say much, just placed my hand on hers and nodded. A few weeks later, while rearranging a small storage cabinet, I found a photo wedged behind a notebook. It was from Brendan's college graduation. Everyone was there. Brendan in his robe, Kayla in a light blue dress, even my sister-in-law from Nebraska. I used to keep a pressed daisy behind the glass tucked in the corner. But this time, I noticed something else. My face had been cut out. Not torn, not folded, cut. Cleanly. I held the photo for a long time. I didn't cry. I didn't tape it back together. I placed it inside a cloth pouch and tucked it into a wooden box I kept at the back of the closet. Inside that box were small things, an old key from the studio, a ribbon from Brendan's 5th grade spelling bee, a birthday card drawn in crayon. It said, "Happy birthday," in large uneven letters. No mention of Grandma. Just a single balloon and a smiley face. I closed the box gently. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel grief. I felt still. People talk about healing like it arrives all at once, but it doesn't. It moves like breath, quiet, slow, present. I never erased Brendan or Kayla from my memory. I simply stopped centering them in a life they had chosen to leave me out of. There's a kind of strength in that, a quiet one, the kind that doesn't need proof or apology. That spring, I planted fresh lavender on the windowsill. It grew uneven, tilting toward the sun, but it bloomed. That was enough. I didn't look back. Not even once. It started with a voicemail from the property office. A woman named Lisa left a message saying a third-party inquiry had triggered a flag on my name. She asked if I had recently authorized any financial transactions tied to the old address. I hadn't. I called Martina immediately. By the time I reached her, she had already received a copy of the inquiry, an unsigned form requesting documents for a loan pre-approval. The email address was unfamiliar, but Brendan's name was listed. Mine was too. Martina didn't hesitate. She pulled the thread. Within hours, she uncovered a string of online activity tied to an account registered under both of our names. The application had been submitted to a regional lender. Attached were scanned documents, an old photo of my ID, a utility bill addressed to me, and a signature that looked close to mine, but wasn't. The details had been pieced together, just convincing enough for someone in a hurry. Martina flagged it immediately and called Ashby. Ashby arrived that afternoon with a leather folder tucked beneath her arm. She reviewed the documents page by page, circling inconsistencies in red ink. "This is layered," she said. "He's not just reusing documents, he's building a false paper trail." She laid out the next steps without pausing an immediate complaint to the bank's fraud unit, a flagged report filed with the district attorney's office, and a hard stop restriction submitted to the county. From that point forward, no one would be able to access, modify, or reference my name or address without verified in-person authorization. She also filed something called a neighborhood registrar freeze, rare but effective. It would quietly alert banks, notaries, and local agents to deny any transaction attempts using my credentials unless verified. Brendan wouldn't be notified. He'd only find out when his next attempt was blocked. I didn't ask what would happen then. I just watched Ashby work the pages, sliding neatly into the folder as she sealed each piece of protection in place. That evening, I sat by the window in my apartment and watched the street lamps flicker on one by one. The hallway smelled faintly of floor polish and the neighbor's stew. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, the packet of documents still unopened in front of me. I didn't touch it. I didn't need to. Everything that needed to be done had been done. There was nothing left to defend. 2 days later, a letter came. It wasn't from Brendan or Kayla. It was from the same regional lender Martina had flagged. The letter confirmed the fraudulent application and thanked me for my cooperation. They included a stamped copy of the internal report, which listed the loan request as terminated under cause. No apology, just confirmation. Martina stopped by that afternoon with a tray of lemon bars. She didn't mention the letter. Instead, she brought news from the foundation. Donations had increased. A small church group in Pennsylvania had organized a fundraiser. Another woman, an 82-year-old retiree in Arizona, had sent a handwritten thank you note and a check for $20. I placed it in a folder labeled Letters to Keep. Later that night, I returned to the stack of documents. I tucked them inside a fireproof case in the closet and locked it shut. I wrote today's date on the spine in permanent marker. Then I sat at the desk, turned on the small desk lamp, and opened a fresh page in my notebook. The pen moved slower now, but my hand didn't shake. The next morning, a message came through. Not from Brendan, but from a mutual friend we hadn't spoken to in years, Rachel Carr, someone I'd worked with back when I first started in consulting. She wrote one line, "He's telling people you gave him permission." I read it twice, then closed the app. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Ashby filed a secondary flag under character defense, something I hadn't known even existed. It didn't carry legal weight, but it sat in the local court records as a time-stamped filing. If Brendan or anyone else tried to shift the story, the facts would already be on record. Quiet factual filed. I didn't see Brendan again that week. The apartment stayed quiet. I walked the trail. I watered the lavender. I stood at the window with a mug of tea as the sun slipped lower each evening. At night, I turned off the light and let the quiet wrap around me like a blanket. There was no anger left, no fear. Just the slow unfolding of truth. And a kind of peace I hadn't expected to find this far along. The letter came on a Wednesday morning, folded neatly inside a plain white envelope. It wasn't from a lawyer or a lender. It was handwritten Brendan's name, signed at the bottom, his penmanship smaller than I remembered. The message was short. He asked if we could meet at the old community garden, the one with the stone bench under the maple tree, where I used to take him after school. No mention of Kayla. No explanations. Just a time and a place. I didn't answer right away. I left the letter on the kitchen counter and took my usual walk along the trail behind the building. The air was sharp, with the first signs of early winter, the lavender on the sill already beginning to curl at the edges. When I returned, I packed a scarf, 2 granola bars, and the small cloth pouch with Brendan's graduation photo inside, the one where my face had been cut out. The garden was quiet when I arrived. A few leaves still clung to the trees, stubborn against the cold. Brendan was already there, sitting on the edge of the bench, hands clasped between his knees. He stood when he saw me, but didn't move closer. I took a seat beside him, leaving a space between us. He didn't waste time with greetings. He said he hadn't handled things right. That much was clear. Then he said Kayla had gone to stay with her sister for a while. He called it a pause, but he didn't seem sure of the word. I listened without interrupting. He told me he'd seen the foundation announcement in the newspaper. Said it caught him off guard. I asked him why he thought I had done it. He paused, then answered slowly. "Because you had to," he said. "Because we didn't leave you a choice." He didn't say it defensively. He said it like someone realizing a truth out loud for the first time. He looked down at his hands. I thought I could fix it without admitting I'd let it happen. I didn't think you'd go through with any of it. I nodded. We sat in silence for a few minutes. Then I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the photo. I held it in both hands, not offering it to him, not hiding it either. He recognized it instantly. I watched his eyes move across the edges where my image had been trimmed away. He didn't say a word. I folded it once and returned it to my pouch. He asked if there was any way to rebuild what had been lost. I told him trust doesn't return on request. It returns when it's carried not once, but over time. He said he understood. I'm not sure if he did, but he said it anyway. We stood. He offered a half embrace. I accepted it, but didn't linger. As I stepped away, I told him gently, the next step isn't mine to make. That evening, I called Ashby. I asked her to draw up the final papers for the foundation's board appointment. Martina had been acting director since we launched, but now it was time to make it permanent. The fund had reached its second stage goal. Small, steady donors, a few grants from women's groups, and one anonymous gift, large enough to expand the outreach program by spring. The next day, I donated my studio above the bookstore to the foundation. It would serve as a resource center somewhere women could sit down, review paperwork, ask questions, and not be rushed. I visited once more before handing over the keys. The space still smelled faintly of printer ink and lemon oil. I left the lavender sachet in the drawer. It felt right to keep one memory where it began. Brendan didn't reach out again that week. I didn't expect him to, but on Sunday, a small envelope arrived. Inside was a folded card with a note in his handwriting. No apology. No explanation. Just one line. You were right. Comfort is easier than courage. I'm trying to choose differently now. I placed the card inside the same wooden box as the graduation photo and the ribbon from his spelling bee. I didn't frame it. I didn't display it. But I kept it. That night, I stood at the window, the one that faced east. The sun had long set, but the street lamp outside cast a soft glow across the sidewalk. It caught the edge of the lavender plant, still holding onto its last bloom. The light wasn't bright, but it was enough to see by. The days that followed settled into a new kind of quiet. The apartment felt fuller, not with noise or company, but with the gentle rhythms of a life lived for myself. Each morning, the sunlight slipped through the east window, falling across the lavender plant, and the single photo I kept by my reading chair. The foundation continued its work. Martina sent updates every week, sharing stories of women who found a foothold just when they needed it most. The studio above the bookstore opened its doors to its first visitors. Sometimes I walked by in the afternoon just to watch the light spill onto the old hardwood floors. I didn't see Brendan again that winter. The last card he sent stayed tucked in the wooden box with the other small tokens of our shared history. Kayla's absence was quieter, a gap that no longer ached. I let those spaces remain. The garden near the old house was mostly empty except for the neighborhood children bundled up and chasing each other across the fading grass. I found peace in that, knowing the world kept moving, carrying joy and sorrow along in equal measure. Most evenings, I made a cup of tea and sat by the window listening to the radio or writing a few lines in my notebook. There were no grand gestures or second chances, just a steady unfolding of days, each one a little lighter than the last. I looked around and realized that what I'd lost in family, I'd gained in quiet certainty. I no longer felt erased or overlooked. I felt rooted, like the lavender on my sill, growing toward the light in its own time, its own way. If there's one lesson I carry from this journey, it's that dignity doesn't come from holding on to what others refuse to see. It comes from letting go, from choosing kindness for yourself when the world seems determined to write you out. Justice isn't always loud or dramatic. It can be the quiet reclaiming of your own name, your own space, your own peace. If my story sounds anything like your own, I hope you remember it's never too late to choose yourself, to stand gently but firmly for the life you deserve. Thank you for walking with me to the end. If you're listening with a memory on your heart, I invite you to share it or simply hold it close. We bloom sometimes not in applause, but in the soft, persistent light of our own mercy.